encompassing everything from approximately 1851 to 2021. So it's quite a large archive I've created. And thanks to Hillary and Eileen with the JCC, I'm able to share my first book programs with all of you, which is for me a great joy. So today's section is Synagogues of the West Side, which, as most of you probably know, had the largest Jewish population and the most amount of synagogues ever in the history of our fine city. So as Jews came to Chicago, they started moving out west in around 1908, 1909. Is that bagpipes? Okay. Do you hear that, Hillary?
If everyone can please make sure that they're on mute, we would appreciate it. It makes it hard for everyone to hear. So please make sure you are muted.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So starting in around 1908, 1909, people started traveling west to the new West Side, Lawndale, and started populating the areas with Jewish congregations in those days. They were delineated not so much by whether they were Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, because there was one Reform synagogue, one Conservative synagogue, and 58 Orthodox synagogues, plus many other community buildings and organizations. So let's start today. So the picture you're looking at is, as it says there, Mount Hebron, which was really Beth HaMidrash HaGadol. That came there in around 1915. Next, please, Hillary. And here is how it looked at the height. Originally a Lutheran church, it was repurposed as a synagogue between 1912 and 1915. Beth HaMidrash HaGadol, of course, started in 1867 and had a very long storied history on the south side, on the west side, and eventually on the north side. Today, it resides in Skokie on Gulf Boulevard. So we have many synagogue congregations that have been here over 100 years, which is a testament to the vitality of the Jewish community in Chicago. Next, please. Okay, here you have a grid. This is kind of neat. This comes from the Jewish Historical Society, and so I'm using that on their behalf. And it gives you an idea of how large the Jewish community was in Lawndale, which is the bulk of what we're talking about, but also reached further northwest in Garfield Park and ultimately into the Austin area. So we're going to be covering North Lawndale, Garfield Park, and at the end we'll have a little smattering of Austin, which had its own small Jewish community. Next, please. Okay, one of my favorite, and my grandparents' synagogue was First Romanian, also known as Sheri Shemayim, which is Gates of Heaven. It was, again, a Romanian synagogue, 100% of its population. If you'll go to the next slide, Hillary. This is how it looks today. It is Stone Baptist Church, and a very dear friend of mine, Philly Kaplan, is in the process of helping raise funds for the restoration of the roof, some of the windows, and with the exception of a couple of missing artifacts, a menorah and a Star of David, it pretty much looks the way it did from 1926 to the mid-1950s when they sold it to the Stone Baptist congregation. If you look all the way to the back of the building, you'll see that building was the original community center that was built in 1911. So even though the actual synagogue was built in 26, they first came out to the west side in 1911 from the Maxwell Street area. It's kind of neat. Next, please. The largest congregation in North Lawndale, of course, was Anshe Knesset Israel. They had, I believe, 3,500 members. And interestingly enough, because it was such a Jewish community, I think it was 80, 90% of the population were Jews. This synagogue, as many, but this one in particular, was open 24 hours a day. There's always classes and learning, which of course is the epitome, the apex of our faith is always, we are people of the book. We are constantly learning and studying and arguing, bringing that to an art form. So this is a great photograph, probably taken right around the same time it is now. You can see some of the snow on the ground. Next, please. Later, of course, it became Shepherd First Baptist Church. These pictures were taken by a friend of mine, Kerry Wintergreen, as the building was being torn down, and he tried to rescue some of its artifacts. And you can see the reason it was torn down is the congregation didn't have the money to keep up with it, and the roof caved in. And you can see here's the women's gallery, a couple areas. Some of the older stained glass windows weren't really the Jewish ones. They were replaced by the Baptist congregation, Black African American congregation took it over. And on the lower right, you'll see the actual demolition of the building. So kind of interesting, the fact that you're seeing this building go from this giant on the boulevard of Douglas Park to what actually happened. Oh, there's my sister Cindy. Hi, Cindy. How you doing?
Hey, Rob.
Next, please. Okay, at the hub of Independence Boulevard, of course, was Kehilloth Jacob. And Kehilloth Jacob was actually a series of several buildings. The main congregation building was right there on Douglas and Independence Boulevard. Behind it, of course, was their Young Israel congregation and a cheder or Hebrew school, and in the back was the youth center. So it was quite the complex. Today, it resides on Devon Avenue in Peterson Park. Next, please. The most orthodox, extremely orthodox, in fact, you had to be conversant in Mishnah and Gemara, the Torah, was Mishnah U Gemara on Douglas Boulevard. The building, of course, is still there today. It is Thompson Hopewell Baptist Church. And the requirements for membership were so extreme, it was a very small, very intimate congregation. And later in the 1950s, I think maybe 1959 or 60, they moved to California Avenue, just north of Peterson Avenue, where they reside today. Next, please. Next building is a question. So some people may agree, some may disagree. Adas B'nai Israel, which today, of course, is on Kimball Avenue in the Hollywood Park neighborhood, was torn down. And I believe this is the last photo boarded up before this two-story classic gray stone was torn down. I'm not 100% sure, but if it's not the exact building, it's certainly a close representation of Adas B'nai Israel, which has been around for over 110 years. Next, please. This is the Markover Shul on Independence Boulevard. Independence Boulevard, of course, not just unlike Douglas Boulevard, had many, many synagogues. This was known as a Shebel synagogue, which means that the rabbi lived in the building and the congregation worshiped there. So the women may have been upstairs, the classrooms may have been downstairs in the basement area, and the main congregation, of course, was on the first floor. The family lived in the back. And this building is still there today, beautifully. This is what it would have looked like probably back in the 1950s before the congregation dissolved. Next, please. One of my favorites and the only Reformed synagogue in the North Lawndale community was Temple Judea. This comes from History of the Jews of Chicago, from Midas. One of my greatest benefactors is the family of Hyman Midas. His grandsons were gracious enough to let me use lots of information and photos from his classic book on the history of the Jews of Chicago. Next, please. So this was torn down not very long ago. Next, there we go. And this is what it looked like. You know, this was taken in 2003 or 4, and I believe the building was torn down in 17 or 18. And we don't know if you look at the very top, if the menorahs were ever, were ever rescued, but like many of the Black Baptist congregations in North Lawndale, the pastors were very, very happy to welcome in the former Jewish congregants and would show them around. A lot of times they had old books and old Taliesim that they were happy to give back to the congregants if they wanted it. But amazing, 50, 60, 60 years later, all these artifacts were still there in these buildings. So they were very, very, very respectful of their Jewish heritage. Next, please. And my favorite synagogue on Independence Boulevard was Anshe Shalom. Today it's Seventh-day Adventist Church. The reason that's really important is, number one, they worship on the Sabbath, our Sabbath on Saturday. Number two, if you go inside and they're very, if it's on Sabbath, you have to be very respectful. If it's during the week, you have to make an appointment. But if you go in there and kind of close your eyes and open them, you'll think you're there in 1930. The windows are still there. The windows are probably the most beautiful, fully protected and restored windows that you'll see of any synagogue in Chicago, and of all the 60 synagogues in Lawndale and the 125 active congregations in 1928-29 on the eve of the Depression, this is the most perfectly preserved synagogue building that you will see. And this picture on the right is from Kerry Wintergreen, who's a very famous architect, part of the Chicago Jewish Historical Society, and just amazing work that he did. Thank you. Next. Also on Independence Boulevard, and you'll know the name, it's Knesset Israel Nusach Sephard, which of course the acronym is KINS, which is in West Rogers Park today, originally there West North Shore Hebrew congregation. So from around 1921 till the 1950s, this magnificent synagogue was on Independence Boulevard, and you'll notice it was in the middle of the block. Very few synagogues in Chicago were on the corner. Some were, but even though these were cathedral, beautiful, magnificent buildings, they still tried to not be where the churches were. They wanted to be a little more discreet, because even though this was primarily a Jewish congregation, people felt, they wanted to be a little less obvious, which may or may not have been that way. Next, please. This is how it looks today. They put some, stone on it, and not particularly beautiful, but it's still an active building. And that's what's important, is that you can still go to many areas on the west side and still you can grasp the grandeur of what the west side must have been like on the high holidays, when Jews were dressed in their finery and would walk, of course, in those days, all Orthodox practically, would walk to shul and pray. And as my mother used to tell me, kids used to do shul hopping. They go from shul to shul, visiting Bubby and Zadie, and they'd either go upstairs to see their Bubby, downstairs stand by their grandpa or their papas. Next, please. On the east side of North Lawndale, this is on Francisco's B'nai Israel. They were there from approximately 1917, 18 till the mid-50s. Ultimately, they ended up on Lawrence Avenue, and that particular synagogue, which you'll see in a different program, eventually became a funeral home. So a lot of synagogues have been repurposed. Some became funeral homes, some funeral homes became churches. Of course, almost all the synagogues either became churches, or in some cases, unfortunately, have been torn down. But you can still see the Ten Commandments at the very top, and it's a beautifully preserved small building. Next, please. This is Anshe Zedek, which is House of Righteousness on South Albany. Again, one of many, many synagogues in Lawndale. Next, please. One of my favorites, the Knesset Israel, Anshe Tickton. This later merged with Mikra Kodesh, and they ended up on Foster Avenue. So if you know about Foster Avenue, just west of California on the north side of the street, that was Mikra Kodesh Anshe Tickton, and that was there until a number of years ago when it was torn down, unfortunately. But if you look very carefully over the archway, the lintel, the pediment, it does say the Knesset Israel Anshe Tickton. And it's still very there, as is the Star of David. At one time where the cross is, there was a magnificent stained glass window. And I invite anyone who's in this group, if you have any photos that can magnify this program and my work, you're please invited to contact me. Next, please. The first synagogue that was built in approximately 1908, 1909 was JTours Anshe Marov on South Sawyer Avenue. It was the second location for the synagogue. But originally in the Maxwell Street area, this was known as the politicians' shul, because all the bigwigs and all the aldermen were members of Anshe Marov, which was magnificent. Unfortunately, not long after not long after I took this photo, this building no longer exists. And that, of course, is the sad part. So the good news is all these buildings that everyone, either their grandparents or great-grandparents attended, we have them in my archive and in my new book. Unfortunately, you can't physically see them and touch them anymore. Please, next. Hever Kadisha on 13th Street. So every major street, every major thoroughfare had at least 1 to 4 different synagogues. This synagogue is famous not because of where it was here on 13th Street, later moved to Devon Avenue, and it was there for many, many years. It was Rabbi Judah Goldman's synagogue, and later became a medical center, and today it's for sale. So again, for over 100 years, it did exist as an independent congregation. Next, please. This is Beth Knesset. Many of you who lived in Albany Park also know that it was known as Knesset Orthodoxy on Troy Avenue in Albany Park. This is one of the many Orthodox synagogues, and you can see here it later was converted to a church. This building also has a controversy because I had to do a poll because many people feel that this was actually a synagogue, and some people feel that the empty lot next to it may have been the actual synagogue. So the reason I put it up here with that little asterisk that will be in my book, of course, is that we're not 100% sure, but we are sure that there was a synagogue, that it was about 50 to 70% think this was the synagogue, and the other 30, 40% think it was the former building next door. Next, please. Nachlas Jacob. Okay, now this synagogue no longer exists in any portion. This is the only physical picture that we have. And that's one of the biggest problems, is that many buildings before I got started in this program back in 2002 were already being torn down. So when I came across this book by Rabbi Kushner on Orthodox rabbis in Chicago, I said, oh my God, this is like so great, because for many, many people, they haven't seen this building since the 1940s or 50s. So again, this was Rabbi Eichenstein's shul or synagogue, and you can see how magnificent it was. There is a story, or Baba Maisa, that possibly it was torn down not long after he passed away. He passed away very young in the 1940s. But in any case, certainly by the 50s or 60s, this building no longer existed. Next, please. And that's one of the other very interesting aspects of my work, is that in some cases, I have the only known photos of many of these congregations. Fortunately, many people still have the stories, but 18, 19 years or 20 years after starting my research and writing, unfortunately, many of the people that I did interview originally, they were in their 80s and 90s, 20 years ago. So unfortunately, they're not here, but their stories do exist. A Lawndale conservative, which met at the JPI, was the only conservative synagogue. And this is from the Levenstam family. They gave me a bunch of information and memorabilia that at least we knew that this one conservative synagogue did exist. And again, the only conservative synagogue in Lawndale. Next, please. Anshe Zidomer Volin, which was on South Holman Avenue and 13th Street, was, as you can see, was a beautiful, beautiful synagogue. Again, this building was already gone by the time I started doing my research. Comes from my friend, Norman Schwartz, may he rest in peace, and he was very gracious with a lot of pictures, as was our main mentor, Dr. Irving Cutler, who contributed to many, many of the photos that you see today. Next, please. So here's this one is one of the ones that was very confusing at one time, because the picture that I originally saw didn't do justice to what I later took a picture of myself. And this is Mikra Kodesh Anshe Tikton, Mikra Kodesh Anshe Lida and Pinsk. So this was the Pinsker Shul, and later this merged with Knesset Israel and moved to Foster Avenue to become Mikra Kodesh Anshe Tikton. As you can see, this building is beautiful. It's magnificent. I would love to have seen a picture of in the center here, where there's the cross, where there would have been the original stained glass windows or Stars of David. But as you can see, this must have been a very, very, very large congregation, because even to this day, nearly 100 years later, this building is just absolutely beautiful. Next, please. Next. Next, please. Okay, so this is Agudath Jacob, which later, of course, went to Evanston, and now it's part of Skokie Valley. But as you can see, this is the way Agudath Jacob looked originally. Now it looks like a church now. So obviously there was an architectural decision that this is what they want their small congregation to look at. In fact, I don't know if many of you are aware, I have a group on Facebook called Synagogues of Chicago, where I kind of test out all of my material with with approximately 1,600 members of that group now. And we actually get people from these obscure little synagogues that actually went there or were bar mitzvah there. So that's quite gratifying. Next, please. Next, there we go. Beth Israel Anshe Yanova, again, was one of many, many Orthodox synagogues in this plain, simple two-story brick building. They later bought the movie theater on Morris Avenue, and they were there for many, many years in the 70s and 80s. And as far as I know, this synagogue is no longer in existence. Next, please. This is Anshe Kobrin. Again, this is one of the larger Shubble synagogues where the rabbi lived in the building and the congregation had their service on the second and third floors, women's gallery, of course. In this building, they actually cut out the middle of the building so they could create a gallery. So in many of these buildings, when they were taken over as churches, pretty much left it the way the original Jewish congregation had them. So if you can only imagine going into a two-flat and all of a sudden you walk in and there's a two-story building, a two-story interior, which doesn't seem to make sense until you understand its Jewish roots. Next, please. Ohel Jacob, which is 10th of Jacob from the city of Kovna on South Holman, one of many, many synagogues on Holman Avenue in North Lawndale. This is the Cary Tertiary Baptist Church today, and it's still there. Beautiful condition, a very active congregation. Next, please. And this is an artist's rendition that came from a magazine article. It has a few nice gang members outside protecting the church. But again, you can see how wonderful they have kept this building in its original state. Thank you. Next. This Anshe Antipol on South Christiana Avenue has a lot of meaning to me because my great-grandfather worshipped here. In fact, when this small building was beginning, it had a dirt floor, and he donated the money to pour concrete so they wouldn't have so much schmutz and dirt there. And when I was very little, my parents must have had a small reversal of fortune because two buildings over, I grew up at 1311 South Christiana. That building is still there today, but back in the day, there was a butcher shop. My Zadie's butcher shop was there, and the back was another building. So in 1911, my bubby saw that Jews were moving out of Maxwell Street, and she got to, I don't know how they got money together to buy property, but they did. They started a little business, and they had a bigger business. As I was told by my father in later years, they had the first refrigerated building. A meat market, which means they must have had ice in their case, and they actually had lights, electricity. Next, please. Anshe Pavlich, Nusak Sephard, and what this means is it's the men of Pavlich. Nusak Sephard means it was the way that they worship, which means they had hard teas instead of soft teas in their worship, in the way they worship, which was something very, very new at that time. And this was on South Christiana. You'll see in parentheses, it says Turner. This was originally known as Turner Avenue, or as my father called it, Turner Terrace, because that was a faster way of saying it. It was renamed in honor of Queen Christina of Denmark. Can't tell you why that was, but according to my friend, Norma Schwartz, that's how the story came about. And if you look, the building's still there, and the name in Hebrew is still above the pediment. Next, please. Okay, this is the Odessa show. Odessa had a gigantic Jewish population back, in the Russia area and the Pale of Settlement. They started coming to America in Maxwell Street in the 1880s and 90s. Again, in the late, like 15, 16, 18, could have been 1920. They built this beautiful synagogue on South Lawndale Avenue and 16th Street. The building is still there today. And if you look very carefully, you can actually see the name of the architect that's still on the lower right of the building. A lot of these buildings today are overgrown, so you kind of have to pull away some of the shrubbery, and hopefully no one gets mad at you. Next, please. One of the largest congregations next to Anshe Knesset Israel was Beth Jacob Anshe Crows, which is House of Jacob, Men of Crows. And as you can see here, it has the original onion domes and Stars of David and a beautiful stained glass window. It's had a couple of fires, but there is a group of local people and original congregation members or their descendants that have restored this building to its original grandeur. Now, whether it's going to be a museum, a historical society, or an active church is kind of being debated now, but this building has been preserved, which I think is pretty great. Next, please. One of the smaller ones was Bekor Olam Anshe Russia, Poland. So by the name, you know that this group was made up of residents of Russia and Poland. And at one time, Russia, Poland were basically one big country. Poland actually ceased to exist as a country from the 1860s till after World War I. So if your grandparents were born in either White Russia or some of these other little towns, they may have said they came from Russia or Poland, but a lot of our, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents actually did come from Poland. It just wasn't called Poland in those days. Next, please. Now here's another one. Here's Beth Abraham Anshe Poland, which is, House of Abraham, men of Poland. Poland is another derivation of the word Poland. On 1533 South Drake. If you'll see in parentheses, it says Clifton Park. We went through a name change back in 1909. And so and that kind of made my work very difficult. When I started looking for synagogues, I had to go through the white pages from 1900 to 1920 to see where these actual buildings existed. And they were under an interesting category, churches Jewish. They didn't even have a synagogue category back in the day, 100 years ago. So so I'm looking for Clifton Park, and thank God for Dr. Irving Cutler. I went through his monumental book, and there it was, South Drake, originally Clifton Park Avenue. Next, please. This is a good B'nai Eretz Israel in South St. Louis. Again, one of the nicer Shtubble synagogues. Next, please. This is Anshe Lubavitch on 15th and Drake, which again was Clifton Park. So this is down the block from Anshe Poland, where we just were a slide or two ago. Building's still there. Obviously, Anshe Lubavitch has a storied history going back to Europe. And after the congregation disbanded from this building, but not permanently, they moved from in the 50s or 60s to Plina Avenue. And today, the only synagogue that actually exists in East Rogers Park, which I, of course, call Rogers Park, the real Rogers Park, is at the Birchwood Nursing Home. So in the Birchwood Nursing Home is a small chapel synagogue, and it still has artifacts from over 100 years ago from the Lubavitcher Synagogue that was on South Drake Avenue. And like I said, it's the only synagogue in existence in Rogers Park today. Next, please. Polet Tzedek started off in the Maxwell Street area in the 1890s. In 1917-18, they built this very interesting synagogue at 1333 South Harding. The small family were rabbis for many generations. Here in the 1950s, they moved to Albany in California, where they still are today. In fact, up until recently, there was another Rabbi Small. There is another rabbi there today, but the Small family is associated with Polet Tzedek for nearly 100 years. And so just so you know, that building no longer exists as well. Anshe Shaval V'Yanova. This is interesting in the sense that the building is still there. Of course, it's now just a building today. It's not even a church. It's just a two-flat. After they left Lawndale, North Lawndale in the 1950s, they actually relocated to the Austin community, which was further west near Austin Avenue, Austin Central. And at the end of the program, I'm actually going to show you the 3 synagogues that were established in Austin from people leaving the west side. Next, please. Lev Sameach, the Tursky family has been associated with Lev Sameach for over 100 years, and they were in many locations. After leaving Trumbull Avenue in North Lawndale, they moved to Hollywood Park on Bernard and Bryn Mawr, which if you go there today is part of Northeastern Illinois University. And if you look carefully, you can actually see the 1955 cornerstone that's still there in the building. So he built a beautiful building. It was there for over 30 years. And I believe the Tursky family is still involved somewhere with some form of Lev Sameach. Next, please. Chassid, Coburn, and Carlin, which were the Stubble synagogue from the people of Coburn and Carlin in Poland in those days on South Trumbull. Building is still there, beautifully preserved, and it's today, of course, a church. Next, please. Tapir of Moshe has a very, very long history within one family. This beautiful gray stone still exists today. As you can see, it is still a beautiful building. Of course, most of the block was blighted back in the mid to late 60s up until recently. North Lawndale has been on a restoration kick, fortunately, and lots of the area that it was burned out during the 1968 riots is starting to be reclaimed again because it's considered to be a pretty valuable neighborhood. Tapir of Moshe today, of course, is in West Rogers Park. So it still exists today. Next, please. Tichvat Yehuda, pardon me. Also on St. Louis Avenue was a larger Stubble synagogue, and their Rebbe was very, very well known and was a very learned scholar. Next, please. At this point, I'm bringing in some community buildings because Jewish hospitals, whether it was Mount Sinai on North Lawndale or Michael Reese on the south side, all had chapels or little synagogues within their confines of the buildings. The neat thing about Mount Sinai, this was an Orthodox synagogue hospital, of course. It still exists today. It's still run by the Jewish Federation. And as a complement to our commitment to our communities, we're still involved here. And it's a fairly up-to-date, gives great care. It's a great facility. It's been updated over the years. But as you can see by that Model T, this is one of the original pictures that I was able to find. Next, please. This is the Grenshaw Street Talmud Torah, which is Grenshaw Street and East West Street on the north end of Lawndale. This was started right around World War I and it lasted until the 1940s. And was one of many small schools, large schools, in and around the North Lawndale community. Next, please. Again, a favorite because the building's torn down and doesn't exist. One of the early Chicago Jewish academies. Now, those of you who go way back further than me will know that Chicago Jewish Academy, CJA, started at the Hebrew Theological College on Douglas Boulevard. They later bought this Masonic building on Wilcox and Pulaski, and was there, I believe, up until late 50s, early 60s when they moved to Melrose Avenue. After that, they moved to Pratt Boulevard, which became Ida Crown Academy, and today they're in Skokie in a beautiful new campus. Next, please. This was, unfortunately, not the best, but a great picture of what the Hebrew Theological College actually looked like in its heyday. It wasn't an illustration. Next, please. This is a picture from the Midas History of the Jews of Chicago, which is a very, very good present representation of HTC. Next, please. This is where I came in and was already boarded up. You can still see how magnificent a building is. And the rumor was they were going to preserve the library, which is over here on the northwest side. But of course, they later tore everything down, unfortunately. But today they are in Skokie. So the Hebrew Theological College still exists and still has a stellar reputation. Next, please. This is what the first rendition of my favorite place, which of course is the JPI, the Jewish People's Institute on Douglas and St. Louis. This was the prototype of the modern JCC. It had everything going on. Again, you can see this is a very early picture. Next, please. This is what it looks like today. It's known as Lawndale Academy. Dr. Cutler and I had the honor of doing an exhibition there of what Jewish life was a number of years ago, with storyboards and pictures. And it was really, if you go inside, it has a beautiful terrazzo entrance, there's a large Star of David there, and a beautiful auditorium with beautiful still Jewish motifs inside. Next, please. And that was built in 26. In 1901, they built BMZ, which is Beth Moshe Zakanim, also known affectionately as Bubby Mitzadi. It was a Jewish old aged home on Albany. And it was there until the early 60s or 70s, and the building was torn down. So if you go to Ogden Avenue in Albany, there's just a lot there today. Next, please. This was the synagogue of Mark's Nathan Jewish Orphan Home. As you can see, this is a more modern picture, but you can see how amazing this chapel was built for the Jewish orphans that were there from approximately 1911 to 1948-49. Later, it was taken over by Sacred Heart of the Chicago Catholic Archdiocese. Next, please. This is a great photograph from Google, and the reason I use this versus my picture is because this is the first time since 1948-49 that the name Mark's Nathan Jewish Orphan Home over the pediment actually you can still be seen, which is for those. And I did, many interviews with residents of the Mark's Nathan Jewish Orphan Home, and I will tell you their stories are just heart-wrenching. I mean, they went there, a parent passed away, they were orphans, they were taken in, but they were treated so wonderfully. Nathan Goldblatt from the Goldblatt Brothers department store chain used to donate an opera seat so kids could have their culture. Every year on their birthday, he would give each kid $1. You got to remember, this is the Depression. Dollar was a really big deal, and they treated the residents there very respectfully, and never a hint of scandal in all the years they were there. Next, please. American Boys Commonwealth on 13th Place across the street from Lawson School. ABC was built on money donated by Jacob Franks. And if you remember his name, his son Bobby Franks was killed by Leopold and Loeb in their thrill killer episode. And he wanted to make a memorial to his son. So he donated money for ABC to keep young youth off the street and give them something productive to do. Next, please. On 16th Street, and Hamlin was the Boys Brotherhood Republican, was another Jewish supported organization, though more sectarian than a religious background. And again, this was a boys organization from that community to help keep the boys off the street. Next, please. Persian Hebrew congregation on South Troy. Of course, today it's on Skokie Avenue in Maine. So this is a shout out to anyone who's listening to the program. If anyone has a picture of the building on Troy, it does not exist today. I would love to get a picture, any type of picture illustration. I've contacted the Persian around Hebrew congregation. No one seems to have any information. This was from their website, so at least we know they existed. This is from their annual dinner meetings. The officers on the left, and the group enjoying their luncheon banquet on the right. Next, please. Okay, all the Jewish funeral homes, as they do today, had chapels or little synagogues. This was the original J. Weinstein and Sons on Roosevelt Road. It went from being a funeral home to being another funeral home to eventually being a church. And it still exists today. And if you go there, you can actually see the name in the terracotta. It says J. Weinstein. Next, please. This is Pizer. Of course, that was 3400 West. This is 3100 West. It was a funeral home. It was a church for a while, and it was restored as a funeral home again. This picture comes to us from Google. You can see it over the awning. I want to give everybody credit for all the contributions they've done. It's a beautiful, it's a funeral home, but it's a beautiful building. At one time, it did have a little chapel. It still may be there, but of course, it's not used as a chapel anymore. Next, please. This is Lawson School. The only reason this non-Jewish building or synagogue is here is because 99% of the population were Jewish kids. So on Jewish holidays, and most of the faculty were Jews. And starting in 1915 or 16, my father went to school here. So 15 or 16, 5, 6 years old, he went to Lawson. And they still have a very, very, very strong, popular alumni association. Next, please. Now, this is something that you'll only see here. Hagro Anshe Wilno, which eventually went to Adams Street, and after that, it went to Evanston, which later became the foundation for JRC, Jewish Reconstruction of Synagogue. Hagro Anshe Wilno was at 3901. I made a mistake on that address. 3901 West Congress, which is, today, if you go there, that's the Eisenhower Expressway, or originally the Congress Expressway. This came to me through a wonderful source whose name, I apologize, I can't remember, but this was taken by the city of Chicago, says they had to photograph every building that was going to be torn down to make way for the Congress Expressway. And so this is amazing because I used to hear stories. Oh yeah, we used to drive up and down on the way to Waldheim. We'd see the synagogue there. And so anyhow, as far as I know, this is the first time since the 50s that anyone has actually seen this building. Next, please. And of course, here's the interior. The only picture I know of the interior. And if Hillary, if you'll put your marker over the girl with the little paper bag on her head, this is Purim. That's Rita Stevens. This was her picture that she graciously donated to me. Next, please. Now we're in Austin, so we're getting to the end of the program, and I appreciate your indulgence. B'nai Israel Austin, which is, if you remember, my first book, Synagogues of Chicago, or Forgotten Synagogues of Chicago. This is B'nai Israel Austin. Rabbi Shlomo Feinberg was the rabbi there forever. And today, of course, it's a church, but if you see the way I did the picture, it looks the way it did in 1923. Next, please. In 1949, they built their Hebrew school. So even 25 years after their building, they still have confidence in the Austin community. So at least till the early 60s, Austin still had a viable Jewish community. That was on Jackson Boulevard. Okay, here is Austin Jewish Community Center. Everyone who's familiar with it knew that Rabbi Lehrfeld was the moving spiritual leader and spirit of this congregation. This is the only picture you'll actually see that has the stained glass windows of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. Today it's covered over with a lovely, beautiful brick motif. God knows why. Next, please. Last of our Austin synagogues is Central Hebrew Congregation. This is Anshe Shaval. So remember, we were talking about it when we were still in Lawndale. This is the rabbi and the president and the members of the congregation. So it's Anshe Shaval, Central Hebrew Congregation, because it was on Central Avenue. Today, it's a Jehovah's Witness building. Next, please. And as you can see here, you can see the Ten Commandments. There's Kingdom Hall for Jehovah's Witnesses. Later, they covered it over. So now, again, there's no evidence that it was a Hebrew congregation. Next, please. We run over to Karlov in Garfield Park, and this was B'nai Abraham Zion. So B'nai Abraham congregation started in the 60s. Zion congregation was built by Adler and Sullivan in the 80s. 1923, they merged and they built the Washington Boulevard Synagogue. And you'll see all the way on the right. Okay, this photo was the only known photo. You can go back to that one. Only known photo that was photographed by Irving Cutler, my buddy and mentor, of what it actually looked like. The first was an illustration. This is an actual photo of the congregation. You can see it was probably taken in the early 50s. Next, please. And the only thing that exists today is the community building. You can see how it was beautiful. So to the left, of course, was the large, beautiful congregation, Reformed Synagogue. And next, even today, if you go there, you can see over the entranceway. Next. It still says Community House, which is all the community centers were called in the early part of the century, and Stars of David are still there. Next, please. Beth Shalom of Garfield Park was one of what we call one of those obscure synagogues. The building is still there today. It's known as Unity Church. They later moved from Gladys to Harrison, and then they disbanded. So of the many 60, 80 synagogues that we were looking at today, some still exist, of course, but most have disappeared. Next, please. And I think we are at the end, yes? Okay, we did it.
You did it. You did it. Fantastic. We have tons of questions. So let me scroll back to the beginning. If you have questions, please put them into the chat box and I will start asking. Susan wants to know, why do you think all these synagogues were sold and turned into churches?
Well, the most obvious reason was because demographically, everything changed. Lawndale just emptied out. Wandering Jews, we always know there's a better neighborhood everywhere. And so even if the original people didn't want to move, their kids didn't want to live in Lawndale anymore. They wanted to live in Albany Park. They wanted to live in Logan Square. They wanted to live in Rogers Park. Some even went exotically to Skokie, Illinois. So this is the main reason. So as they left, There was, at one time they had these attorneys that were like intermediaries because some Orthodox congregations felt they couldn't sell their synagogue to become a church. So they sold it to an attorney who sold it to a church. So, kind of sleight of hand, but they did because, first of all, the neighborhood changed overnight. It was peaceful. It wasn't like South Shore that we'll talk in a subsequent program that I hope to do for JCC. So it was a very peaceful transition. But what were you going to do with houses of worship? People weren't coming back to North Lawndale, to the west side, to pray anymore. It's not like, you moved to Skokie and you came back to Rogers Park because that's where Bubby and Zadie were. You weren't coming back to the west side. So what were you going to do with these, especially these cathedral, these magnificent buildings on Douglas Park and on Independence Boulevard? So that's why. Next, please.
Richard wants to know, are there any photographs of the interiors of these synagogues, which would likely be more obviously Jewish than these rather genetic exteriors?
Yes and no. The vast majority, no. Almost, unless people have them in their own private collections or archives. I do have a number of interiors. I don't show that because you can see, this is one neighborhood. I used to do a whole program in an hour. You can see how long it takes to get through just one neighborhood. So, in my book only has the buildings. I'm thinking that a subsequent DVD maybe or CD will include more anecdotal, class pictures and newsletters and interiors. So I'm in the process of trying to find interior photos. So again, that's a shout out to everyone here and in my Facebook group, that whoever has information or pictures, send them in, because there's something that we can do. And at the spry age of 70, I got more than enough time to get that done.
While you're answering the next question, I'll get the link to your Facebook group and put it in the chat.
Okay.
Ezra says that he heard a story that when Turner Avenue was changed to Christiana, half of Anshe Povilec moved out for 5 years because they did not want to be on Christina Avenue. Is this true?
Yeah, actually it was, because the rabbi was known as the Turner Rebbe. Okay, well, he didn't want to be known as the Christiana Rebbe because that didn't sound quote unquote kosher. So I'm trying to think. They either went to Anshe Volin, they went to another synagogue, either in their basement or in the back or whatever. Yes, but they did relocate for a period of time. That actually, well, it's a rumor, and I believe that was true.
Okay. In the white flight epidemic of the 50s and 60s, were any of these properties simply abandoned and not sold? That came from Robert. Okay,
Robert, number one, there was no white flight. This wasn't South Shore. It was a very peaceful change from approximately 1954 to 1959-60. So, I mean, it wasn't like, I heard stories when I went to college that my friends that lived in South Shore, would go to sleep one night and their neighbors were gone the next morning. They actually, snuck out in the middle of the night. No, that was not the case. So there was no flight in that respect. With rare exception, no, the buildings were sold. The preparation was made for them to be transitioned into a Black Baptist missionary church. So I think maybe it's possible that some of the apartment buildings were abandoned, but I don't even think that was the case, because I know when my parents moved to Humboldt Park for a number of years, we were still going back to the old neighborhood, to fix things. I remember the sewer smell in the basement at 1311 South Christiana. So, and I was just a little boy, of course, in the 50s. So yeah, no, I don't believe anything was ever, certainly not a synagogue was not abandoned.
Rivka wants to know, Anshe Lubavitch was not Hasidic, was it? It was simply named for the place of origin.
That is correct. It was Lubavitcher. It wasn't, it's not the same Lubavitch, it's the same congregation, but it's not the same connotation that you see today. That's correct. I don't know that there was any Hasidic synagogue congregations in Lawndale. I know the most Orthodox, the super Orthodox was Mishnah Gemara. Okay, but they were super learned. They were they knew Torah, Mishnah, and Gemara like coal. Okay, but I don't know if anyone would have been considered Hasidic in those days.
Fred asks if Rabbi Small's son is still the rabbi of Polet Tzedek.
Okay, Rabbi Small's grandson. as the last time I was able to check, there is another person who's a rabbi there. I last talked to the Rebbitzin, I want to say yesterday, it was probably, 6, 8 years ago. And she was wonderful. I mean, talk about a hip woman who was like, almost a century old. Michael was the rabbi. Let's see, Michael Aaron, I think his name, Michael's son was Aaron. He was there for a while, then he was gone, and then he was back. But I believe the rabbi attached to that synagogue, I can't think of his name right now, but I don't think it's a small anymore.
Everything else is just comments about reliving, things that people recalled from their childhood. So last call for any questions. I will tell everybody that this afternoon at 2:00, we are replaying Rob's original program of an overview of all the synagogues. So that information is on our website and you can register there, jccchicago.org. I don't see any more questions. I have to tell everybody that I really have a fantastic time putting this together with Rob. He sends me all the pictures. I kind of put a slideshow together, and then I get a preview of what he's going to talk about when we check to make sure everything's functioning properly. So it's a real treat for me. I did not grow up in Chicago. I'm from the East Coast, so it's really informative for me. So we will be talking to Rob for our next tour. We'll decide where that's going to be.
One comment though,
Yeah.
A shout out to you, Hillary. Just so everyone knows, the research and photos are mine, but the technical part of this program, what you're looking at now, could not happen without Hillary. I don't know how she does it. She makes it sound like, like I'm writing, like I'm taking, in my old days, I would take a group of photos and put them in order and I would do a program, my quote unquote PowerPoint, which is really just some kind of slideshow. To do this, what you're seeing today, which seems it's effortless for her. It still belies my imagination, how she can just at the last minute, and I do that to her all the time. I make her crazy. I say, oh, can we add just a few more photos in here? So for many of you, there are a few, turns out there are a couple of synagogues missing from this, which we're going to improve for the future. But as I say, this is a complete joy. I'm so glad to see everybody here. And if there's any other comments, you can let Hillary know and she can let me know how we can improve it. I hope I didn't say too many uhs or it wasn't too fast. But my wife's not here today. She's usually telling me to slow down, or she writes me little notes to give me information. So Fern's not here to help, but I have Hillary and I thank her so much.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it. Again, I'm going to drop the link to Rob's Facebook group. If you have any pictures that you want to share with him, that's a great place to put them. You can also reach out to me at hwank@jccchicago.org, and I can forward anything to Rob. So thank you again, Rob. We look forward to having you back. Everyone, take care, be well, and we'll see you soon.
Shout out to my sister, Cindy. Good to see you, honey. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you again. Thank you, Hillary.